Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the June 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of L.N. Tolstoy and the Modern Labor Movement from 1910 by Lenin. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. We're also on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/Socialism S4A, where you can download MP3 versions of these works. So, I mentioned that this is being recorded for the June 2022 edition of Socialism for All. Specifically, today is Friday, June 24th, 2022, and it was just announced this morning that the U.S. Supreme Court has overturned the Roe v. Wade decision from the early 1970s, which made abortion federally legal in the United States. With that overturned, it's now on a state-to-state basis, and many U.S. states have very restrictive laws regarding abortion. Some it's completely illegal, some there's a 6-week ban where you can't get an abortion after that, etc. It is really bad news. This is not good for the working class, half of whom roughly have uteruses. It is about power, it's about creating a vulnerable working class, more vulnerable working class, and also creating a large army of unemployed, which helps to keep wages down. Those are some of the reasons for this move. The right wing has been organizing furiously for decades, the left not so much, and this needs to change immediately. It has been changing somewhat over the last few years. It now needs to go into hyperdrive. We need to hit critical mass. This thing needs to start snowballing. Specifically, anyone in the U.S. left needs to know, you need to be able to recite it in your sleep, the Democratic Party is not reformable, and it's not an appropriate venue for U.S. workers to organize in. They're an imperialist party. They take money hand over fist from big banks and insurance companies and every other enemy of the working class. When you organize a workers' party, the party needs to be a multi-purpose organizing hub, not just for electoral politics, which is just one slice of it, but for engaging in class struggle in all different arenas, really whatever is going to be effective. Labor unions, tenant unions, community organizing of all types. And you need to do that within a hub that is free of bourgeois or capitalist influence. The Democratic Party is never going to be that. It is capitalist influenced, capitalist dominated top to bottom, even down to the very local level. So you will hear opportunistic sock Dems sometimes saying, oh, we got to run as Dems because that's how you win. No, you don't really win anything. Even if you win an election, you lose the overall struggle because you're not building anything. It's about building a workers' party that is a multi-purpose organizing hub for a many-faceted class struggle. Again, the Democratic Party is never going to be that. Just see the Bernie Sanders run, the attempt at gate crashing. It's never going to be transformed into that, ever. So we do need that, though, but we have to build it ourselves. No one's going to hand it to us. So just so happens that the fourth largest political party in the United States is the Green Party. And they do meet the minimum criteria for this, and there are other left parties as well. But basically things like not taking corporate money and putting large transformational demands on the system that probably the system cannot fully deliver on, but that's the point. You want to get as much as you possibly can in terms of reform out of the system and use those reforms as propaganda that we need to keep pushing, that the system is going to hold us back, and that eventually, after we've done a lot of organizing and agitation and gotten more out of the system and formed a competent and powerful counterpower to the currently, very well-organized, wealthy and powerful capitalists who are the dominant power. Well, after we've done all that and gotten very strong, organized, mobilized people by the tens of millions to this cause, where they're thinking about it every day, they've internalized it, they're writing about it, they're talking about it, etc., that's when people become really receptive to, we need to completely abolish capitalism, this entire system and everything attached to it. You can't really start at that point. I mean, you can obviously explain it to people, but you need to build up momentum to where that can actually become a reality. There needs to be a revolutionary buildup. Now, we're at the beginning of that process. People are still kind of hemming and hawing. Some of the early adopters are doing more in terms of forming unions and joining parties and getting organized, that's really good. We're still not at critical mass at this point. So we've really got to do a lot of agitation around getting people to break out of the long-standing pattern. I say that basically the US left has two modes. One, trying to reform the Democratic Party, and then two, dropping out and doing nothing. Well, that can't be an option anymore. It's got to be realizing that the Democratic Party can't be reformed and that it's just going to keep delivering more failure, loss, tragedy, and destruction to the working class. And not dropping out and doing nothing, but getting organized. Again, Green Party, minimum starting point. And there are other left parties as well, whatever you feel like is the next step for you. That's how we move beyond just memes. That's how we bring this to life in the real world. That's what needs to happen as fast as humanly possible. So, what I will say is these are difficult times. There's a lot of bad news. And it is disturbing to see how much US Americans will accept without pushing back. There are many reasons for this. One of them, for example, white America often doesn't care about what happens to black America. Straight America doesn't always care about what happens to LGBTQ plus America. Documented America doesn't always care about undocumented America, and so on. In other words, there hasn't necessarily been the best class solidarity across all of these other lines. And then when the topic does come up, a lot of times it's people from the more dominant status, whatever it is, telling the relatively less empowered people to basically suck it up and just, do what they say. That's not solidarity. That's just bringing bourgeois oppression and prejudice into the working class movement. It's not helpful. Anyway, while these have historically been a lot of problems, and it does concern me how much the US will just sit there and take, there is truly a new, emerging, post-boomer, radical revolutionary consciousness that shines in times like this. When news like this comes out, you see the outcry, you see the outrage. It is good, and it wasn't here 10 or 20 years ago, not in the same way. But it needs to be amplified by organizations. It needs to be harnessed, pulled together in ways that are effective, and not just left to rot on the vine. It's got to come together into useful, organized activity that is planned and strategic and is capable of actually inflicting damage on this system. It is within our grasp to do it. People are already starting to do it. I just think that this is one of the most important things to harp on for anybody who hasn't yet. It needs to be your priority. Believe me, the orgs want to hear from you. When you're in an org and you're doing the email or phone or social media for an organization, all you want is people to contact you. They want, operators are standing by. In other words, just say, hi, I'm a leftist, I'm a socialist. I am interested in helping build your party. What can I do? Believe me, they will tell you. All right, so I think that's enough for intro comments right now. Let's get to today's short reading, and then we'll come back and discuss. Basically, I chose this because there's a great quote about despair from Lenin here, and why revolutionary proletarians should not. So, again, the title is L.N. Tolstoy and the Modern Labor Movement. It was first published in Nash Put, number 7, November 28, 1910. Published according to that text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 16. HTML transcription and markup by R. Simbala, and it is in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive at marxists.org. Fantastic resource, go check them out. Let's get into the text. The Russian workers in practically all the large cities of Russia have already made their response in connection with the death of L.N. Tolstoy, and in one way or another expressed their attitude to the writer who produced a number of most remarkable works of art that put him in the ranks of the great writers of the world, and to the thinker who, with immense power, self-confidence, and sincerity, raised a number of questions concerning the basic features of the modern political and social system. All in all, this attitude was expressed in the telegram, printed in the newspapers, which was sent by the labor deputies in the Third Duma. There's a footnote there. This refers to the telegram sent to Ostapovo by the Social Democratic or Marxist deputies of the Third Duma, which is the Russian parliament, to V.G. Chertkov, a close friend and disciple of L.N. Tolstoy. Quote, "The social democratic grout in the Duma, expressing the feelings of the Russian and the whole international proletariat, deeply mourns the loss of the brilliant artist, the irreconcilable and unconquered fighter against official clericalism, the enemy of tyranny and enslavement, who loudly raised his voice against the death penalty, the friend of the persecuted." Unquote. Back to the text. L. Tolstoy began his literary career when serfdom still existed, but at a time when it had already obviously come to the end of its days. Tolstoy's main activity falls in that period of Russian history which lies between two of its turning points, 1861 and 1905. Throughout this period, traces of serfdom, direct survivals of it, permeated the whole economic, particularly in the countryside, and political life of the country. And at the same time, this was a period of the accelerated growth of capitalism from below and its implantation from above. In what were the survivals of serfdom expressed? Most of all, and clearest of all, in the fact that in Russia, mainly an agricultural country, agriculture at that time was in the hands of a ruined, impoverished peasantry who were working with antiquated, primitive methods on the old feudal allotments, which had been cut in 1861 for the benefit of the landlords. And, on the other hand, agriculture was in the hands of the landlords who in central Russia cultivated the land by the labor, the wooden plows, and the horses of the peasants in return for the, quote, cut-off lands, meadows, access to watering places, etc. To all intents and purposes, this was the old feudal system of economy. Throughout this period, the political system of Russia was also permeated with feudalism. This is evident from the constitution of the state prior to the first moves to change it in 1905, from the predominant influence of the landed nobility on state affairs, and from the unlimited power of the officials, who also, for the most part, especially the higher ranks, came from the landed nobility. Quick note about dates here. So this is written in 1910, which was pretty much dead in the middle between the First Russian Revolution, 1905, Lenin just referenced here the first moves to change the constitution of the state, and the 1917 revolution. There were actually two revolutions in 1917, the February Revolution, when the Tsar was overthrown, and then following that, the capitalists set up a provisional government, which they dominated, and then the October Revolution, just less than a year later, when the Bolsheviks took power. So that provisional government following the Tsar was not around for long. Continuing. After 1861, this old patriarchal Russia began rapidly to disintegrate under the influence of world capitalism. The peasants were starving, dying off, and being ruined as never before, fleeing to the towns and abandoning the soil. There was a boom in the construction of railways, mills, and factories, thanks to the cheap labor of these ruined peasants. Big finance capital was developing in Russia, together with large-scale commerce and industry. It was this rapid, painful, drastic demolition of all the old pillars of old Russia that was reflected in the works of Tolstoy the artist and in the views of Tolstoy the thinker. Tolstoy had a surpassing knowledge of rural Russia, the mode of life of the landlords and peasants. In his artistic productions, he gave descriptions of this life that are numbered among the best productions of world literature. The drastic demolition of all the old pillars of rural Russia sharpened his attention, deepened his interest in what was going on around him, and led to a radical change in his whole world outlook. By birth and education, Tolstoy belonged to the highest landed nobility in Russia. He broke with all the customary views of this environment, and in his later works attacked with fierce criticism all the contemporary state, church, social, and economic institutions which were based on enslavement of the masses, on their poverty, on the ruin of the peasants and the petty proprietors in general, on the coercion and hypocrisy which permeated all contemporary life from top to bottom. Tolstoy's criticism was not new. He said nothing that had not been said long before him, both in European and in Russian literature, by friends of the working people. But the uniqueness of Tolstoy's criticism and its historical significance lie in the fact that it expressed, with a power such as is possessed only by artists of genius, the radical change in the views of the broadest masses of the people in the Russia of this period, namely rural peasant Russia. For Tolstoy's criticism of contemporary institutions differs from the criticism of the same institutions by representatives of the modern labor movement in the fact that Tolstoy's point of view was that of the patriarchal, naive peasant whose psychology Tolstoy introduced into his criticism and his doctrine. Tolstoy's criticism is marked by such emotional power, such passion, convincingness, freshness, sincerity, and fearlessness in striving to go to the roots, to find the real cause of the afflictions of the masses, just because this criticism really expresses a sharp change in the ideas of millions of peasants who had only just emerged from feudalism into freedom, and saw that this freedom meant new horrors of ruin, death by starvation, a homeless life among the lower strata of the city population, and so on and so forth. Comment. It's like when libertarians are always talking about freedom, like freedom to be homeless. Yeah, that's capitalism. So, I mean, in this context, you have peasants who, for generations, time immemorial, had lived off the land. This is a radical, radical change, going to an urban environment, trying to work for wages, completely different. Continuing, Tolstoy mirrored their sentiments so faithfully that he imported their naivete into his own doctrine, their alienation from political life, their mysticism, their desire to keep aloof from the world, non-resistance to evil, their impotent imprecations against capitalism and the power of money, the protest of millions of peasants and their desperation. These were combined in Tolstoy's doctrine. The representatives of the modern labor movement find that they have plenty to protest against, but nothing to despair about. Despair is typical of the classes which are perishing, but the class of wage workers is growing inevitably, developing and becoming strong in every capitalist society, Russia included. Despair is typical of those who do not understand the causes of evil, see no way out, and are incapable of struggle. The modern industrial proletariat does not belong to the category of such classes. So that's the end of the audiobook. What is Lenin saying here in the conclusion? So he's contrasting the representatives of the modern labor movement, the modern in this case being 1910, against the earlier, 30, 40, 50 years prior peasant movement. So the peasant class was dying, in other words. The entire way of life, the economic system that supported peasants living where they lived and being peasants and all that kind of stuff, like all the activity that they engaged in and that they built their lives around. That economic system was being upended. And so they were moving to the cities and being confronted with dirty, noisy, ugly environments that were not, living out in the countryside and all that kind of stuff. Their class was dying. And so that's reflected in Tolstoy's works. And that is the perspective of a class which is getting subsumed into the proletariat. In other words, these peasants were being proletarianized, as we say. And they were not adjusted to that. They didn't really see themselves as proletarians. They still carried the worldview of a peasant now forced to live in the proletarian way of life. That sort of upending of all the social norms and everything, the habits, the customs that you're used to, really plunge you into kind of a despairing, confused, in sociology we sometimes say anomic, concept called anomie, normlessness, when just your sense of what is normal gets completely disrupted. What is socially expected of you, what you do, in other words. Being in that anomic state, very uncomfortable, can really lead to people being dislocated, and is connected with a study on suicide to give you some idea of, how deeply this can impact people in a negative way. But Lenin is saying here that despair is typical of the classes which are perishing, but the class of wage workers is growing, developing, and becoming strong. So, continuing the quote, despair is typical of those who do not understand the causes of evil, see no way out, and are incapable of struggle. Now, we see a lot of this in the United States today. A lot of despair. I think it's safe to say that in the United States, there is a lack of understanding of the causes of these problems. There are a lot of people who see no way out, who, for example, think that just voting Democrat more and more is going to somehow do it. That is going to definitely lead to despair, and are incapable of struggle. So again, this is what I'm saying. Get organized, get involved in some organized struggle. It may be spontaneous at first, but it's got to become progressively more strategic, planned, and productive in the end. So despair is typical of those who do not understand the causes of evil, see no way out from them, and are incapable of struggle against them. Lenin concludes by saying the modern industrial proletariat In other words, class-conscious workers who have adjusted to that status, embraced it, and see that the future belongs to the proletariat. They do not belong to the category of such classes, which are despairing and everything else. When you become class-conscious and you see that the proletariat is the definite heir to this entire world that we are building under the capitalists, well, then that's not a cause to despair at all. We have a lot to gain. We have a future, but we do have to fight for it. So unlike the peasants who, feel that they had just lost everything, etc., they did not really understand their new class position, etc., and that's what was reflected in the works of Tolstoy. As we move on into the 20th century and Marxism takes hold and you get parties like the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party and other solid Marxist parties and leaders like Lenin spreading these kinds of writings and doing this kind of teaching, well, then we get workers who understand what the stakes are. And if you're new to all this, in Marxism we have something called historical materialism. Basically, this says that ever since class society, which is an unequal type of society, started a number of thousands of years ago, most of human history we lived as hunter-gatherers, where there was very little technology, if any. There was very little sort of stores of food or property from year to year. People were nomadic and, again, mainly lived hunter-gatherer, maybe a tiny bit of agriculture here and there. That was an egalitarian, communitarian type of society where everybody had to work and everybody got equal spoils because the group needed everyone's labor in order to survive, and so people were treated as equals. And this was kind of the way that humanity existed sort of, quote, naturally for most of our history. However, whatever it is, 10,000 years ago, class society starts, quote, civilization, and we develop an unequal society that builds up property and builds up technology and builds up stores of food, etc. And then there become questions about unequal division, who rules the society, who works in the society, and so on. And this has taken different forms over time. There was the early slave states, there was feudalism, there is currently capitalism, and socialism, which is attempting to emerge out of capitalism now. What is key about socialism versus capitalism is that capitalism and everything before it, it's a minoritarian ruled society. So the ruling class is a minority class. Now, capitalism was progressive versus feudalism in terms of, instead of just a few royals governing feudal society, capitalism had a broader ruling class, but it was still a small minority of the overall population, which exploited the rest of the population. But in that process, running capitalism in a society, it creates the next class, which is up and coming. Just like feudalism created capitalists, capitalism is creating what? The proletariat. Because basically over time, two great classes emerged. The capitalists, who are few in numbers but great in terms of their property, and the proletariat, who don't have much property but are the overwhelming majority of society. The sort of, crudely expressed in the decent phrase, now a standard, household term, the 99% and the 1%. It's actually a bit more complicated than that, but that's a decent starting point. The thing about socialism is that all it takes is for the working people, who are the overwhelming majority of society, and actually this class was created by capitalism and the property relations initiated by capitalism, just have to organize, to combine, and get rid of the capitalists and then abolish the system, abolish the private property that capitalism is created on, and all of that previously privately held industrial property, all the workplaces, all the factories, all the restaurants, everything, the raw materials, so on and so on. Well, abolish that private property status, make it collective property, and move forward into socialism, which is the first time that the ruling class is also the majority of society. And from there, you start to build socialism on day one of the revolution. For a time, some of the contradictions and inequalities left over from capitalism still persist. That early socialist society is still stamped with the characteristics of the capitalism which gave birth to it. But as the revolutionary society proceeds, you iron them out, And you complete the process of proletarianization by proletarianizing even the capitalists. Eventually, everyone is one class, which is another way to say there are no classes anymore. So it is a classless, eventually stateless, as all of those bugs get worked out, and the government of that society becomes less about managing people and more just about running the industry, which of course has its own logic to it, which no matter what you might want it to be, you have to obey that. That's what Engels' On Authority is about. You know, if you're planting crops, you can't just plant them in the dead of winter, they won't grow. So in a certain sense, we are slaves of industry here on this material plane, but on the other hand, the way that we organize human society is within our grasp, and we can eventually cast off the parasites who would have us just work for them. You know, it's bad enough to be stuck here on Earth having to do all the things that we have to do to materially exist and survive. It's even worse to be enslaved by someone who is, you know, biologically your equal for really no good reason. This is the struggle against capitalism, against wage slavery. So, about despair. In closing, we went through this in the 2020 election. Big topic, first year of the channel. One of the things that I said then is all the anxiety that the Democrats put out, this is their anxiety. It's not ours. You know, their struggle with the Republicans, these different factions of the capitalist class, which at the end of the day, they're on the same page. Their interests align on virtually everything. They just, you know, there are certain little divisions within their class about how best to do what they're doing, but their interests are not our interests. So we should not pick up their anxiety. Just like the dying classes, they despair because they see no future ahead. We are the proletariat. We have a future. Again, we have to fight for it. And you have to know what the causes are and how to struggle for it, just as Lenin said. And we need to do that because, you know, I think that why there's so much despair going around in a place like the United States, other US-influenced places of a similar type, is, first of all, that the workers, you know, don't really understand capitalism, don't really know what's going on. Although more and more people are having a conversation about that, getting educated about it. That's why we're doing this channel here, so that people can learn about it in an accessible way and learn how to struggle against it so that we can claim the future that is coming to us. And also, a lot of it is this sort of Stockholm syndrome, you know, referred anxiety and referred despair that is given to us by the sort of dying liberal faction of the capitalist class. You know, all the people who talk about how, you know, oh, our democracy is on the brink. The United States is an oligarchy, not a democracy. This was proved by the Princeton study on democracy. It isn't a democracy. It is just ruled by the rich, period. Workers really have nothing to gain by perpetuating it. Now, with a caveat, you want to use the freedoms afforded by bourgeois society to their utmost in order to advance the struggle. But you don't just appreciate them sort of in and of themselves as just daily life. You have to exploit them to advance our interests as workers, which are not in keeping the system around. It's an important point for people to understand because, again, use the freedoms afforded by bourgeois society to fight for socialism, but don't just stand around and sort of, you know, fight for that version of capitalism in and of itself as your end goal. Not at all. But let me also, and I'm going to end on this, throw in a third possibility as far as the source of this despair. And I guess it kind of ties in with that sort of, you know, dying, watered down left liberalism of the Democratic Party. But the dying middle class, the dying social chauvinist middle class that has ridden on the spoils of imperialism within the United States for a long time, finding that that increased standard of living, this way of life of living off of the many countries which the United States militarily and economically dominates around the world, that even that is no longer providing a good life in the United States anymore. Those super profits are not being shared with the working class, and that, quote, middle class, which is just a labor aristocracy elevated out of the U.S. working class to create the illusion that, you know, we're not being exploited as much as we are, etc. That is creating some despair as well. People seeing that come to an end And, this is like all the discussion about, quote, we're becoming a third world country, very sort of condescending, classist way of looking at the countries that your country has actually been exploiting to prop you up. So I think that there is some of that sort of dying middle class despair. And you see people like Liz Warren trying to do political messaging off of that still. There's no saving the middle class. Also, we should not save it. That is the socialist point of view. What we want is socialist abolition of capitalism, leading to international cooperation among the working people of the entire earth. No more classes, not more middle class. More middle class is not the goal. Having a good life is a goal, yes, but not within the context of maintaining class society, which people like Liz Warren, etc., are certainly out to try to hang on to and maintain. When we say class society, we're talking about capitalism. We want to end that. They do not. The best that Liz Warren, though, is going to give you is sort of a green militarism, as she was advertising in the 2020 Democratic primaries, that, we can keep the middle class strong. We can keep dominating the rest of the world, getting all these super profits from other countries that we're imperialistically exploiting, and then we'll keep feeding those to the middle class. No, we need to end class society and initiate an era of international proletarian-led cooperation. That can only proceed with capitalists out of the picture, out of power, their activities suppressed. And that's how we're actually going to be able to solve problems that are really making people despair. The plastic in the oceans, the climate crisis, which is already an extinction crisis for many species. It's not the only source of an extinction crisis for many species, but it is a major one that could easily get completely out of control very fast, and could also become an extinction event for humans as well. So understand the causes, see the way out, and become capable of struggle. Those of us who get it and are doing this stuff, we really just need more people to show up and get involved. That's how we're going to turn this around. Get organized, make the demands, whatever they are. Abolish the Supreme Court, abolish the Senate, abolish any institutions which are not democratic. Pave the way towards actual workers' democracy, worker control, not just capitalist democracy where 1% or 2% or 5% of the population really has all the political power. Get organized and make the demands. Take them to the streets, pick up momentum, pull more people into the movement. Again, we need to be mobilizing tens of millions of people, and we can do it, but not if we stay joined at the hip with the capitalist parties, and if we don't organize independently for ourselves, and then engage in every form of class struggle which is available to us and will be effective. We have to do it. So I'm going to leave this there for now. What do you think? There's a lot going on. Do you have a question? Do you have a comment? Leave it in the comment section. We'll continue the discussion there as always. Specifically on the abortion rights being overturned in the United States, I just want to say look up the Plan C pill. P-L-A-N-C, like Plan A, Plan B, Plan C. There is, I believe the website is plancpills.org, and there's a lot of information there. These are safe, obtainable by mail after a telehealth consultation, way to end a pregnancy up to 10 weeks. So there are some options that people can get their hands on now, whatever is coming down the pipeline. So anyway, we'll probably continue on that. I'll also put a link to a recent video that I did about abortion rights in the US. Thanks again for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful, and they've allowed me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I would have been able to do otherwise. We don't run ads on the channel. It's non-commercial. So that support is really vital and much appreciated. Thanks to all the patrons. Otherwise, after the content's been created and uploaded, engagement counts. So liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting, even if it's thanks or good video, all of that's great. We do love to see a good discussion going, not a debate, but just a discussion. People who actually want to learn things and are coming in good faith to learn them. We want to see, again, tens of millions of people involved in this movement. This channel is one port of entry into it, and we want to help to usher in as many people as we possibly can. So do reach out. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.